Hey, what's up guys? Coach Dino here, and this is my, I think, 9th video log, and we are 16 weeks out from my first competition. My weight is sitting around between 185 and 190 pounds. For this first contest, I have to be about 176 pounds, 10 or 15 pounds away, and it's kind of ahead of where I need to be. I'm actually going to do a mini cut 3-4 weeks, really bring down my body fat before the 12 week mark, and then actually going to eat up for about 2 weeks, really to bring my metabolic health back up so I can cut down again and hopefully retain much more muscle glycogen as I'm cutting towards the competitions, mainly because I need to be going into my first competition on as high a calories as possible, because I have between 2 and 4 more competitions after that where I'll want to be starting off quite high, especially because the most important competition for me is the last competition. So I hope that makes sense. But today, as you can see, working out, it's morning. I think it's about 6:30, and on the weekends I do cardio on the evening of the Saturday, and then I just have a little protein, go to bed, and then I wake up and I do a low carbohydrate cardio session, or a glycogen depleted cardio session. Again, the goal is to improve the mitochondrial function, so you actually get more mitochondria if you train in a fasted state. It doesn't have to be fasted, it can just be glycogen depleted. So again, one-off sessions don't really matter. If you want to fast and do a cardio session, by all means, it's not going to kill you, but we're looking at chronic adaptations over this 26 week prep, and the things that happen to your body if you repeat them. So today's workout is powered by science, as you can see, and I want to get into a couple topics today. The first one is this Thrifty gene hypothesis, and it's the idea that, I know what I'm doing to my body here because I understand physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, things like that, but the reason it works and the reason I get the desired response from my body is that our genes have adapted over a million and a half years to live really well in a certain environment. There's been all these external pressures, external stresses, stress being anything that disrupts homeostasis. And homeostasis is this idea that your body likes to maintain kind of a balanced environment within itself, and stresses, whether it be physical, biochemical, or like nutritional, psychological, and mental, things like that, those types of stresses disrupt homeostasis, and if it's repeated, you get some type of adaptation, and that's kind of what's happened to the human body. So you get changes within the human body, so you get adaptations in one individual, but then certain environments will then preferentially select certain individuals for survival. So if you have a certain trait that helps you live in a certain climate or with a certain food source, you're going to survive, and the human body's still adapting now. Evolution is not something we see day to day in humans, but we can see it in the lab. We can see it in bacteria. We can see it in other species like the moths during the Industrial Revolution. So there's a preferential selection for dark colored moths because of all the coal and smoke in the air and on the buildings. And these moths, the ones that were darker weren't eaten by birds because they were hidden So eventually all the light moths were killed out, and that's kind of how evolution works. Is now these species of moth is a different color. And when you look at any species in the wild or in captivity, or even at yourself, you're the product of millions of years of selection. So external pressures, and at some point different lines of this tree have died off, and you, or the species you're looking at, is the product. So I know a lot of times you'd like to look at someone and say, how is this person still kicking it? They're not the brightest person, they're not the most fit, but their genes made it this far, and there's probably some type of reason for that. So if that makes sense. But this thrifty gene hypothesis is that the genes that we have were selected because our body is very efficient, and it's very thrifty in that our body has this design to go through famines so we can survive going without food for a very long period of time. That's why we have this ability to take free fatty acids and store them as triglycerides in our adipose tissue. So it's energy stored in fat for further use, so we could put them back in our bloodstream. So you mobilize these free fatty acids and then oxidize them in the aerobic system. But we also have this capacity to take in large amounts of energy. So if there's a famine for any prolonged period of time, we'll use what we've stored. But if there's a feast, so if we're able to get excess calories in, we're going to get a storage of these excess calories in the way I described. So very thrifty, and it's for survival. And we can see now in some studies that calorie restriction is linked to a lengthened life expectancy. So these mechanisms still exist, and they're attributed to survival in the Paleolithic era. So these adaptations are made. These adaptations were produced so we would survive in the environment of the Paleolithic. Now, if you go back 10,000 years ago, towards the end of the Paleolithic into the Neolithic, there was a big shift in our physical demands. So, we went from 8 to 16 hours of activity every single day, by every single member of our population base. We're foraging for food, we're migrating, we're building shelter, we're evading predation, we're hunting different types of animals. And then all of a sudden, over the course of 50 to a few hundred years, we've developed this ability to plant and seed our own crops, which then allowed populations to be sedentary. And this spread throughout most of the population groups of the world relatively quickly. We went from moving 8 to 16 hours a day to moving maybe 8 hours a day. We're not having to migrate, but we're still having to tend fields, hunt food, tend to livestock, build shelters, things like that. So we're still active, and we're still relatively healthy, because the thing about crops is they're only in season certain times of the year. So we have this access to food, we're having to store it. If we don't have enough, we go through famines, and certain animals are hibernating in the winter. So again, we probably went through periods of famine during the winter, and this was probably healthy for us because it kept our metabolism healthy, because we went through periods of feasting when we had the availability of food, and then some periods of famine, and this plays into the regulation of blood glucose, insulin sensitivity, metabolic rate, lean body mass. So lots of different processes are affected by, caloric intake, but also caloric restriction. So now you can fast forward another few thousand years to the modern era, and I'm thinking anywhere from about 1000 AD to now. Cities are popping up, people are becoming much more sedentary. There's definitely a social stratification in terms of the distribution of labor and the distribution of wealth. The richer you are, the less you moved. The poorer you are, the more you moved. Also, your access to food is definitely stratified in that the more power you have, the more food availability you had. You could get things that were kind of out of season and then you could get things that were in season. You could get your population base taxed, giving you more money for more food, things like that. So you definitely saw the health status of both ends of the spectrum greatly affected by the availability of food and the amount of activity. Fast forward now to 1900s, 2000s, and we went from moving 8 to 16 hours a day, and I bet you, I've been doing this for almost 10 years, and say the average person moves less than 2 hours a week in terms of any real activity. And the sad thing is that the recommendations through Health Canada, we're only advocating for about 3 hours of activity a week. Here in Canada, we have a suggestion of 2 days of weight training and 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity. So comparing that to our ancestors, that by itself is not enough. We need to look at the restriction of the readily available food, because food procurement now involves going to your fridge. If your fridge is empty, maybe you'll go to the store, but you're never without food. You're never restricting your intake. If anything, the majority of us are over-consuming for the majority of our lives. Think of even your hero buddy, the one that's maybe going to the gym 2 hours a day or 1 hour twice a day. That's still only 14 hours a week. So we're still not achieving nearly enough activity, for what this body was designed to do. And you can see that disease, especially preventable disease rates, are on the rise, and will continue to be on the rise until we develop a strategy to combat this easy accessibility of food. So how are we going to get people to eat less? And it has to be a voluntary thing, because right now there's this extreme sense of entitlement in that I'd say 9.9, 10 out of 10 people are saying, I work hard, I go to the gym every so often, I should be able, it's my right, I should be allowed to eat whatever I want, whenever I want. And the truth of the matter is that, we're a very, very complex machine. We've been adapted to a certain environment. It's going to take hundreds, if not thousands of years to adapt to what we've developed now, maybe shifting our metabolism to be able to take in more calories and move less. But we're seeing already this gradual selection kind of, towards, a larger body mass. So being overweight is the norm. Being obese is almost the norm, like the staggering rates of obesity. I think it's one in 3 are obese, and 70% are overweight. Being overweight, you put yourself at a high risk of, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, which can progress to type 1 if not treated with diet and exercise, if you only treat it with medication. So there's a lot of, things we need to tackle in terms of getting people to voluntarily move more and voluntarily restrict calories. And I've been doing this a long time, and the more I learn about physiology, you know, and specifically the body's responses to food, and how, you know, exercise by itself is not enough. So you add exercise in, you get an initial response, maybe an initial adaptation, but your body adapts to it relatively quickly. And a good example of this is if exercise was enough, there would not be an overweight construction worker. There just wouldn't be, right? Because, you know, constructors, laborers, I've been a laborer, you know, they're working 10, 12-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week, lifting heavy things, you know, being very labor intensive. And I can tell you right now, there's probably a very high percentage of them that are overweight. So activity is not enough. To the same token, I'm sure you know 1 or 2 people, if not more, that repeatedly diet. So, for instance, my mom, I can't remember a time she wasn't on a diet for her whole life. As long as I can remember, Weight Watchers, all these different point systems where she's restricting or attempting to restrict her calories, but I think that a lot of those strategies allowed her to consume very low amounts of food, not sustainable amounts of food, to the point that you often binge or you reward yourself for your restriction maybe every few days. So that's just bringing up your average, but also you're getting that loss of lean body mass every time you restrict your calories, reduction in metabolic rate every time you diet. And if you're not combining that with strength training exercise, you're going to see a decline in your body's response to the diet, and probably some weight gain over time. And statistically, somebody who diets will 95% of the time gain the weight back, and about 30% of those people gain more weight than they started with. So you can see that just dieting, and I've mentioned this before, is a pretty sure way of gaining weight. So we need to get away from this whole idea of just dieting, you know, temporarily or chronically restricting calories, and determine another strategy. So what we need to look at is what is a balanced approach that'll allow us to still enjoy life and maintain somewhat of a healthy body fat percentage to decrease our risk of certain illnesses. Now, I think we need to look at the Paleolithic body. In the Paleolithic era, nobody was eating for optimal performance, right? So nobody was an athlete, right? There was no sport. Probably there was, you know, maybe some form of entertainment, but there was no elite sport. Nobody was eating for performance, nobody was training for performance, and then nobody was training for looks either. So nobody was trying to look a certain way. The social pressures were probably negligent because there wasn't widespread media, you know. There wasn't this idea of a norm or an ideal body type. So the way people were eating was for survival, and it was very likely that someone's body weight and body mass fluctuated season by season. And this is just how the way things were, probably universally, and everyone was okay with that because, again, it was about survival. It wasn't about health and performance. So I think you need to take anything from the Paleolithic and put it in a context of survival, not optimal. And that's why you won't see me promoting the Paleolithic diet or the paleo diet, because you can't say, hey, this is what our ancestors ate 10,000 years ago, must be right for us, because you're not trying just to survive, and your activities are significantly different than the activities of somebody from that era. So there's definitely a big difference between the nutritional requirements then and now. So what we need to do is we need to find methods or ways to replicate some of that and then modify the rest for optimal health. So I've talked about this in a couple more videos, but you need to take a look at what you do as an individual in terms of your energy intake. So if you just want to track calories, that's cool. But the thing about calories is they're not all created equal. Different calories have different roles in your body, right? Protein, carbs, and fats have different roles. We tend to eat too little protein, too little fat, and too much carbs. So, stratifying your nutrients so that maybe you're eating a little bit more protein, a little bit more fat. Maybe you have to reduce your carbohydrates a little bit. And then take a look at your energy level and say, this is what I consume on average. This is what my body does on average in terms of its weight or body fat percent. If I reduce it by a certain percentage, maybe I'll get some type of response. So that's one way to look at things. The second thing is look at your total activity. So I know, I've talked about activity trackers and the benefit of knowing how many steps you're doing in a day. That's just a small snapshot of, your activity level, but it gives you a good idea if you're moving, because I know that the majority of people don't move enough. I know the Heart and Stroke Foundation says 10,000 steps a day minimum for optimal health. Now, I usually encourage all my clients to get trackers, and I think about 80% of them, I've got 40 plus clients, I'd say about 35 of them have an activity tracker. And it's in those first few weeks and months that you learn as an individual that your steps are generally, I think on average most people get about 3,000. So that's 30% of the minimum requirement. I think if you're doing 8 to 16 hours of walk in a day migrating, you're probably moving pretty slow, but you're going to get a good 10, 20, 30 kilometers in a day. So if you can up your step count eventually over time to 15 or 20,000, you're going to get 10, 12 kilometers of movement in a day. And I think there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago, and what they demonstrated was that activity interspersed throughout your day is much more effective than trying to catch up at the end of your day, especially for health risk. So you get someone sitting for 8 hours at their desk, they say, okay, now I'm going to go to the gym for 3 hours to make up for all the activity I didn't do. They find that it's just much more effective and reduces your risk for disease, not only for disease but for joint mobility. So you get these adaptations to chronic immobility like shortened hamstrings, weak quadriceps, atrophied glutes, tight backs, rounded shoulders, internally rotated arms, projected necks. You can correct these, or you can prevent them by moving at least once an hour. So if you have an activity tracker on, you can get an idea of how much you're moving and set hourly goals. So if you can do 1,000 steps an hour for the 16 hours you're awake, that's a pretty good goal. On top of your resistance training a couple times a week. And the resistance training, I try to stress this with all my clients. My goals with my workouts for my clients is never about calorie expenditure. We can create a caloric deficit through energy restriction and increased non-exercise energy expenditure. So step counts, going for walks, those are the ways I like to increase activity. The point of resistance training is to get chronic adaptations that influence metabolic rate. So you get increase in lean body mass, but you also get a decrease in resting blood glucose, better insulin response. You get increased bone mass and mineral density, increased joint stability, probably increased range of motion in a lot of your joints, strengthening your connective tissue. So all these are chronic adaptations to resistance training that will positively influence your health, but also increase your lifespan and your quality of life. And one of the main killers of women is these falls, and I've talked about it in my sarcopenia video, but we need to reduce bone loss and muscle loss, and that can only be done by 1, getting enough protein, 2, keeping your body mass down, so not becoming overweight, because you become extremely overweight, you tend to have a higher estrogen, lower testosterone, and again, that'll negatively impact your lean body mass. Then resistance training, so getting in and lifting things that are heavy and always challenging your body to the point that it needs to adapt. And I think that that's the thing that people don't realize. You know, when you see people, you know, going to the gym and going through the motions, it's good to be there, but if your job is just to expend calories, you're probably just wasting your time. It needs to be to the point that you're, you know, causing certain adaptations, increase in muscle size and strength, and all the other adaptations. Because, you know, most trackers, most machines will overestimate calorie expenditure. And, you know, a 60-minute bout of resistance training, if you're resting between all your sets, to, you know, maybe a resting heart rate or pretty close to your resting heart rate, you're probably going to expend less than 200 calories in that hour. And if you're only going 2 or 3 times a week, 600 calories a week of caloric expenditure is really nothing in the long term. Some people say it's better than nothing. You know, it's better than nothing, but you'll adapt to that relatively quickly, and all that's going to happen is you're going to eat more food, because people that exercise just tend to eat more on average. And I like to use this paper where, actually I don't think it's published yet, but it's what they did is they had people do sprinting or regular aerobics, and then they let them go into a buffet, and they recorded kind of the amount of energy they consumed. And the sprint groups always consume more calories because they perceived that they worked harder. The problem was that the trial was energy matched, in that the people doing the steady aerobics versus the people that were sprinting were burning the same amount of calories. But there was always a perception of the harder I worked, the more calories I could eat, or the more food I was deserving. So we always see that when people take up the gym, especially things that are hard like resistance training, they tend to eat more, and that usually offsets any calorie expenditure from the gym. So I always suggest exercise should be multi-focused. So you're trying to move more to create a negative energy balance. You're trying to eat for your goals. So if your goal is weight loss, maybe you should be eating at a lower average over the week, and that can be achieved through daily caloric restriction. It could be achieved through intermittent fasting, so maybe eating 8 hours of the day and fasting 16, or it could be through like a weekly fast, so one day of the week just consume a few protein doses, and the other days eat normal meals. But whatever you do to create a negative energy balance, that'll help you lose body fat. And then you know, remembering to hit the weights, and hitting the weights with chronic adaptation in mind. So you're trying to get stronger, you're trying to get bigger, you're trying to become more expensive to operate, and you know, that's kind of what you need to do when you look at exercise. So I hope today's discussion made sense. Again, if you have any questions, post it in the comments below. Hit like, hit share, hit subscribe. New episode of What the Fitness coming on Wednesday. I got to get to my behind the clipboard episodes up here. Should be one up sometime soon, kind of on what it's like to be a personal trainer, that kind of stuff. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the gym. Peace.